District Judge Shira Scheindlin's decision on August 12 to call the practice of stop and frisk unconstitutional in the court case Floyd versus the City of New York was made after 3 months, upon listening to weeks of trial testimony. The civil rights lawsuit, which was brought to the court by the Center of Constitutional Rights, one of the most proactive civil liberties groups against stop and frisk, exposed the police practice as having stopped more than 80% of people who were Black or Hispanic, of which 90% were released after being found innocent of any suspected crime. They went on to include that the ramifications of stop and frisk include long-lasting emotional and psychological impact, as well as collateral costs such as loss of jobs, public benefits, and access to shelter or public housing. They explained it was all based on racial profiling, which is an illegitimate reason to search someone directly under the Fourth Amendment, as well as the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The practice is also said to be based on police simply deciding for themselves whether they believe someone is suspicious. All that the practice realistically accomplished, according to its critics, was wider disconnect and distrust between law enforcement and the communities it protected. However, according to supporters, especially New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, stop and frisk has brought crime significantly down since its implementation in 1994 under Mayor Giuliani's broken windows policing strategies, which promoted aggressive enforcement of minor offenses on the theory it will prevent serious crime. They claim that stop and frisk is a vital tool in the crusade against gun violence, gang activity, murder, and drugs.
Aggressive order maintenance, zero tolerance policing began in 1994, and the crime drop continued between 1994 and 2001. But it started well before then, and it was very significant during the Dinkins administration. What you see from 2002 to present, while Bloomberg has escalated use of stop and frisk, stopping up to 685,000 in 2011, crime is basically evened off. Slight crime decline, but almost none, while stop and frisk has skyrocketed. And in the last 2 years, 2012, 2013, we've finally seen a big decline. A big decline in stop and frisk, simultaneous decline in crime. Stop and frisk has nothing to do with the decrease in crime. And you see across the country, throughout the world, crime is down. New York has had a big crime decline. That's a wonderful thing, but it has nothing to do with stop and frisk.
An associate professor of the CUNY School of Law, Babe Howell teaches criminal law, criminal trial advocacy, and lawyering skills. She is particularly interested in the effects of policing of minor offenses and alleged gang affiliations and the impact such policing has on the legitimacy of the criminal justice system in communities of color. I asked her how practices like stop and frisk affect our criminal justice system as a whole.
If you are stopped, as many of my students of color are, law students, medical students like the plaintiff Floyd in this recent case, they are stopped over and over because of the color of their skin. For some students, they brush that off and go right on, but when it starts, it's a rite of passage almost for our 14, 15, 16-year-old kids. Some of them will respond in angry ways. So using stop and frisk against innocent New Yorkers because they look like some subset of people who are criminals, but using it for no other reason than the color of their skin and what they look like, can create circumstances that make people less law-abiding. What happens inside courts is we often get unconstitutional stops and searches, leading to seizure, often of marijuana, for example, and we criminalize people of color for things that white people do all the time and are not criminalized for. If you go down to 100 Center Street to Manhattan Criminal Court, you will see 90% of everyone in there, Black or Latino, being criminalized for activity that white people do all the time. That sends another message about our criminal justice system, that we have two systems.
Five Muallamak is a civil rights activist and organizer with the campaign to end the new Jim Crow, with a mission to, quote, challenge the culture of racism, repression, and retribution that sustains mass incarceration. The campaign seeks human rights for all members of society non-violently. Five got involved in the campaign in the year 2012. As someone who's been in the system, I asked him if stop and frisk is proactive policing.
When you say proactive, it's the opposite of reactive. So you're not reacting toward a situation. Proactive is positively looking at a scenario and taking the best step forward as into solving that scenario positively, progressively, that gives you the best results. So when you look at the results of stop and frisk, what do we have? 500,000 one year, and then 650,000, then the 700, 850,000, over 1 million stop and frisk. All of this that produced 1% of arrests. It's not proactive in any way. So of course you have police departments that support this cause. Why do they support it? Because they have undermined initiatives. They have incentives to work against, of course, the public. Besides its racial background and, of course, its diversity in which certain segments of the city that it's only practiced in, because it's a practice. It's not a law. It's actually illegal. It's actually unconstitutional. But you have to look at the history of it and why it is. In the 90s, you had Clinton that created a $30 billion crime bill, and this bill actually funded, and of course Reagan also, who took community-based funding for mental health industries, and then you had a funding giving to community-based law enforcement agencies. So what happened now is that they only get funding when they have these certain amount of drug arrests. So you take the Fourth Amendment and you just throw it out the window, and you say, okay, the right to deny illegal search and seizure is out the window because it's a drug arrest. So it validates, violation of personal property, personal space, and of course the right to the Fourth Amendment. But what it also does is create funding. So you have officers that cannot get funding unless they have these arrests. In my personal situation, I had officers, and like the lieutenant said that was involved in my case, he had to do what he had to do because he had to create cases, or else he couldn't feed his officers.
On the onset of the stop and frisk program in the 1990s, the New York crime drop was twice the national average, with homicides, robberies, and burglaries dropping 70%. And in the 2000s, while the crime decline of the country flattened out, the crime in New York dropped an additional 34%. According to NYPD statistics, considering the difference of crime rate now, over 10,000 blacks and Latinos are alive today who would have been dead had homicide rates remained as they did in the 1990s. In regards to the allegations that the process is racially discriminatory, the commissioner and mayor retorted NYPD's resources were allocated in minority neighborhoods due to the fact that statistical crime data showed that's where the most crime was occurring. They also went on to say that stop and frisk practices were to protect those same communities and to give them equal footing in the world.
So when he says he's cleaning up these streets, where are you actually cleaning them up at? You're not doing a citywide program where stop and frisk is enacted in every part of the city or any part of it. You're doing it in certain individual parts of the community, and you're using certain funding based off of like FEMA funds from the terrorist organizations that attack the city, and you say you have funds to stop that. So anti-terrorism is now practiced in 145th Street or 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the train station, where they're looking for plutonium and uranium in somebody's bag. Not even where these issues had happened at. Bloomberg, in my opinion, of course, is looking for that niche, that great niche. He's the only mayor that, of course, have been somehow voted in for 3 sessions. He's been in for 3 terms, and he's increased wealth for the rich, but not for the middle class or not for the poor, in which the city mostly is made up of. New York has always been made up of the working people and the population of that. He, I feel, is looking for great achievements and trophies to add onto his list, because he cannot have any commonality. He doesn't have any relation toward the people or the working people inside. And you can see that through his actions. Stop and frisk is not making the city a better city. You look at Mayor Koch, who was the mayor when the city was somewhat at its crime peak. When we had 4 or 5 murders a day, okay, that's okay. It's okay, it was a good day, And what he did was he created a military-style drone enforcement inside of the communities by putting expectations in, by having the UF-250 forms for stop and frisk, by putting expectations on officers that go out into the community and just harass the people because they have a quota to fill. So that is not quality policing. He's actually looking for a trophy to make an example for other states. And people leave New York law enforcement positions and go to other states and have prominent positions in other law enforcement areas because they say we're tough on crime. But if you're being tough on crime, you're just being tough on crime in certain areas, quote unquote, the bad areas, which just happens to be Black and Latino areas. I don't think so.
The court ruling by Judge Scheindlin essentially stated that the case is about if New York City had a policy or custom of violating the Constitution by making unlawful stops and conducting unlawful frisks. It deemed that oversight regulations need to be in place because the city's highest officials have turned a blind eye to the evidence that officers are conducting stops in a racially discriminatory manner. According to court-ordered plans to fix the practice, NYPD precincts in each borough that have the highest number of stop and frisk must have their patrol officers wear a camera device for a year. And then, the court-appointed federal monitor, NYPD, and civil rights advocates would evaluate the costs and benefits of the program. The video recordings will determine if some minorities are indeed stopped simply as a result of their race or based on their suspicious activity or appearance. The judge cites the success of similar programs in Rialto, California. That town's police department had equipped half of its police officers, about 54 officers, with small cameras that recorded daily interactions with civilians as part of a study for 1 year. After the trial period, it was concluded that the cameras served as a deterrent for both parties. It actually diffused volatile situations. Even though Rialto has a population of 100,000 and its police force is the size of only one of NYPD's precinct, Judge Scheindlin still found merit in and concluded it should be tested out in a pilot program. Mayor Bloomberg described the camera pilot program as, quote, a nightmare, arguing that it would bring more questions than answers, like when should the camera be on and off? Did the officer tamper with the angle to obstruct view? Should it be on when someone is giving confidential information?
But it will show if the officer goes beyond the legal limits of the frisk, which is outside of the clothes only, not inside the pockets. It will eliminate those illegal searches, and it will lead both person stopped and police officer to avoid use of force or other sorts of confrontation. So the cameras will be hopefully as well received here as they have been in other places. And I hope to see in a few years all NYPD patrol officers using them.
The judge ruled that an independent monitor will have to work with the independent inspector general that the New York City Council just created a position for. The 51-member council, headed by Speaker Kristen Quinn, also a candidate for the mayoral elections coming up, voted to override a veto for 2 bills that Mayor Bloomberg opposed. The council overwhelmingly passed the 2 bills collectively known as the Community Safety Act. One bill called for the creation of an independent inspector general with the subpoena power to study and make policy recommendations to the department. The other would open up the state courts to individual claims of bias-based policing. The question remains over how effective the bills will be in police activity.
To persuade city councilmen to pass a bill in a veto-proof majority is very significant. Will the bill create a flood of lawsuits? No, it won't. The bill does 2 things. One is it expands the definition of profiling to cover gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, and housing status, public housing people. But it does not provide a private right of action for monetary damages. It only provides injunctive or declaratory relief. So there's very little incentive, unfortunately, and only very wealthy people or large groups of people could bring a suit under the Profiling Act.
Considering how the NYPD serves as the model for other police departments across the nation, the implementation of the judge's oversight policies will be carefully scrutinized by all cities and state police departments. This case and the NYPD's regulation of the new oversight laws will be the starting point on discussions of stop and frisk for a long time to come. Nicole Smith is a clinical law professor and supervising attorney in the Criminal Defense Clinic at CUNY School of Law. For over 10 years, she's been working to advocate for the rights of indigent people accused of crimes. Prior to joining the faculty, she was a public defender at the Bronx Defenders. I asked her if she agrees with Mayor Bloomberg that by adding too many layers of oversight, it will only confuse the officers on how to implement orders.
There are always going to be folks who are carrying guns on the street, and there are going to be folks who are not carrying guns on the street. And the way that the police have been approaching this issue is to stop everyone who is black or brown or in a certain community without any specific information or specific suspicion about whether they're they're carrying something or not. And that is not, it's not constitutional, and it's not an effective way to get guns off the streets. And the numbers even say as much. In all of the 2.5 million stops that the NYPD has made, and frisks, the frisks that they've made, the 2.5 million frisks that the police department has made, over 98% of those stops resulted in no recovery of any gun or weapon. So that not only says that the approach is unconstitutional, but it's not even effective, because if you're saying this is the way we get guns off the street, well, in 98% of the cases, that doesn't happen. And so, there has to be a better approach, one that is constitutional. And to now say that people have a private right of action to be able to sue the NYPD or to sue officers because they've been racially profiled is helpful, it's useful, it's definitely a step in the right direction, but it doesn't necessarily address the issues of access that go on in low-income communities of color. A lot of times people can't access the courts, and to be able to bring a lawsuit takes a certain amount of ability that many people just don't have. It takes economic ability, it takes familiarity and access to the courts, and many people just don't have that ability.
Mayor Bloomberg's public statement during a radio appearance that nobody racially profiles caused quite a stir. It's hard to say that racial profiling doesn't exist in a country where race and racism have had a long and complicated history, from the particular institutions of slavery to the civil rights movements of the 1960s, and the efforts to right the wrongs of the past with programs such as affirmative action. According to Nicole Smith, when it comes to racist practices and its unconstitutionality in regards to stop and frisk, it will take years before it's corrected.
The United States has had a long history of racist practices and policies, and in the not so distant past, we've dealt with segregationist laws that really had quite a negative impact on Black people and people of color. And it took a lot, those were laws that were on the book. It was racism that was legal. And even though those laws were found unconstitutional, it took many years, and is still a work in progress in many ways, for the practices to diminished in their impact on Black people. And so what we're facing now is a period of time where there are practices and policies that aren't explicitly racialized, but they have an impact on Black people, Latino people, that is disproportionate. So an overwhelming impact on people of color. And those in some ways are a different kind of challenge, because if it's not explicit, how is it that you go about changing something where you're talking about the impact rather than an explicit policy? And stop and frisk in New York City is one example of that, where the policy itself, it doesn't in any way reference race, but the way it's been carried out has been disproportionately impacting people of color in New York City. And it's particularly challenging. And although the recent federal court decision in Floyd versus City of New York found the way that New York City was carrying these practices out to be unconstitutional, it's going to take a long time in terms of work, in terms of remedies, in terms of changing a culture to actually bring about that kind of change that people are looking for.
Well into his second term, many are asking whether the Obama administration has been gearing any of their policies to giving an equal footing to all races.
I think President Obama is in a unique position because he is a Black man, a man of color, that folks are looking to him to be a unique voice on this issue of racism. And I think that is particularly challenging. That being said, there have been some recent developments, particularly in regard to criminal justice, that have some promise in terms of the impact that it will have on people of color. So, for example, our U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder has recently come out to discuss mandatory minimums in drug sentencing laws and the changes that his office will be taking in enforcing those kinds of laws. And what we've seen over the past several years is the war on drugs and what that impact has been on people of color. What it's resulted in is huge numbers of Black and Latino men being incarcerated for long-term prison sentences for low-level nonviolent drug offenses. And so to have the Attorney General come out and say, recognize that there is this problem, that it has this impact on Black men, Latino men, on their communities, and take a stand in terms of how it's going to be addressed is promising. I think there's a lot more that can be done, without a doubt, but that is just one step that's happened recently that gives us some hope.
While the U.S. government is slowly trying to keep up with the ever-changing dynamic of the diaspora that make up the United States, minorities are still very underrepresented in legislative and regulatory bodies. For instance, the U.S. House of Representatives is made up of 83% whites and 17% minorities, and the U.S. House of Senate is made up of 96% whites and 4% minorities. Meanwhile, America continues to have its communities evolve and redefine themselves. Most young Americans now expect and embrace diversity casually, something that older generations needed to learn through sometimes painful experiences. President Obama's vision is to reinforce this unity by building an American community that is based on the common elements of national culture. While the definition of community for Americans has evolved and changed, there is still a long road ahead.